you'll notice, among other things, that the experiencer, the spirit, which is inside of all the garments that you see here, is wearing on the outside, with a dark background, which would correspond to Bina on the Tree of Life, is wearing what amounts to the knowable universe. In other words, the Tree of Life represents all that we can know. And all that we can know is the universe, which is, of course, a large order and takes a while to understand, a couple of weeks or so. But this is the outer garment of the Fool. And then inside of this garment, the inner lining of this black garment, which is the universe, is the desire nature, represented by the red that we see here, the Rajasic nature. And finally, the white garment represents the sattvic nature. And as you recall, in key 10, we had this represented by the sulfur over here, representing the Rajasic, and the tamasic, which was the darkness, was represented here by the salt, and the mercury represented the sattvic nature. These, of course, are the three gunas of Hindu philosophy. The important part is to remember that our spirit is something else from everything that is going on. And since this particular work that you and I are involved in is a work of liberation, it's very important that somewhere along the line we get the spirit part of ourselves straightened out, so that we understand that it is not what is going on. It is not the play. It's the experiencer of the play. And furthermore, as we know, there are techniques involved in this work to help us to write the play ourselves, rather than to just be involved in it in, we'll say, a very small way, as carrying a spear or something like that, as they say in the trade. So, our intellect is represented by the dog, and you'll notice that it's purified. That is to say, it has the color of spirit rather than reflecting the earth, which would be the darkness. And of course, we know from our deliberations here over the weeks, months, and years that the mind, which the intellect and the mind are the same thing in our very rough way of describing things, the mind has two aspects. It has a dark aspect, which represents the earth and reflects the earth, and then it has a light aspect, which represents the more spiritual aspect of ourselves. And in this particular instance, of course, the mind is reflecting the more spiritual aspect. As a matter of fact, since dogs are marvels of attachment, the intellect has attached itself to the divine spirit in ourselves, which is represented by the living being that is inside all of these garments that you see here. Of course, again, this white rose that you see here represents the purified desire nature. And what this means is, as we've said many times, it doesn't represent the Victorian notion of the desire nature as a dirty thing which should be thrown out as soon as possible, but rather it is the very means by which we achieve our aspirations. And the purification of the desire nature simply means that it becomes single rather than diverse. When it's all over the place, we are driven by it all over the place, and this isn't much fun for us, believe me. So you know that this particular key is a synthesis of the whole tarot. In fact, Paul Case, when he produced that monumental, it used to be $1, I don't know what it is now, a little book called The Highlights of the Tarot, he had the Fool on the outside. Later, the Hermit was put on the outside, but in the original edition, the Fool was put on the outside as the synthesis of the entire tarot. And it has everything in it that is in the tarot. One way or another, it's all in there. The mere fact that the Tree of Life is on the outer garment is quite significant in this respect. The only thing that the Fool needs is creative power. And of course, this is symbolically represented by the wand and the wallet, which are obviously a phallic symbol. And of course, the phallus represents the creative possibilities of life. Hence, the bull, Olaf means the bull, and the bull always represented in the old days, represented the creative aspect. And one of the things that we're trying to do here is to get into the area of creative activity, which has nothing to do with karma as we normally conceive of it. So this high country that you see here, of course, is, you might say, the native land of our spirit. It is not something that is living in low country, but living in high country, and it has great vistas. And the eye of the spirit, as you know from your own experience, sees great distances and sees into things in a great way, and again, it has an almost illimitable vision. Vision is very much associated, of course, with the Fool. The fact that it is an airy spirit in the three mother letters of the Qabalah, Aleph, of course, represents the air, and Mem, water, and Sheen, fire. Now, it's the life breath that's represented here, the thing that is alive, which is what we are. And of course, it's associated with fire, and so it's also called the fiery intelligence, because in our own life, we know that the breath actually sustains what we call life. So there's an intimate mixture between, we'll say, Aleph, Mem, and Sheen in this particular key, even though the emphasis of Aleph in the three mother letters is the air. They're really something that you cannot take apart any more than you are supposed to take apart the three top aspects of the tree. The Aleph would be corresponding to the principle of consciousness, and the Sheen would correspond to the energy aspect at the top of the tree, and of course this would correspond to Mem, or the water. The fact that the Fool is going to do a dumb thing and step off the side of this cliff and go to his doom is very important, because this unconcern of the Fool has to do with what we normally call karma. And the Fool is above karma in the sense that you might say God is above karma. The essence of life is not bound by karma because it's creative, and it's always just a little bit ahead of everything else that's going on. And insofar as we involve ourselves in a more creative way with our essence, of course, we get out of the tangles of karma. Well, we've been into this before, and we can go into it again as many times as you wish, because it's a very vital part of the whole process of becoming. The sun in the background of this key, which is colored white, of course, is the central sun of life, and it corresponds not to the solar aspect, which is, of course, very important in our lives, but to the central spiritual sun of the entire universe, which is a sustaining factor that is not mechanical in the sense that we can observe the solar force working in ourselves in detail. The subtle force that sustains the entire universe, which is like God, you might say, is quite beyond, you might say, scientific analysis, which applies very well to the solar force that's operating in ourselves. We can see it quite scientifically and trace the movement of it in ourselves and in the life around us. And I'm speaking specifically of living beings. But when we get to, what sustains the whole thing, we get into an abstraction which is represented by the white sun. Well, that's a start. I'm sure you can help out from now on. Yes?
I just learned something really interesting in hieroglyphics. The picture of the eye means to make. It's the verb to make.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Which I, right away thought of the creative vision.
That's very interesting because in the meditations on the Qabalah, in the Book of Tokens, for instance, it says in the meditation on the letter Hey, it says, I am both a vision and a voice. And then it goes on to say, of course, that this is the creative power and so on and so forth. But you know from your own experience as an artist that if you can't envision something, you can't produce it. So the eye is involved in the making in the very beginning.
You have to be careful, though, I noticed in art. I can't conceive of it too good in my head. I have to almost I have to leave it a lot open.
Well, the reason is that in real art, rather than commercial art, in real art, you actually touch the creative essence. And so you're not expected to know exactly what is going to happen. In fact, it would be very dull if you did. If you're a commercial artist, you know exactly what's going to happen. You're going to paint a can or depict a can of tomatoes and put it in a proper position in the ad, and you're going to get paid anything from $10 to $10,000, depending on who you are. But in real art, the inspiration which comes to you is coming directly from the creative aspect. And it wouldn't be much fun if you knew exactly what it was going to be, you see. See, we, even though, we don't think of ourselves as being important all the time, the creative aspect in life is always working in us. And if we become aware of it, well, we can more or less salute it as something that's going on in ourselves. It's a poetic inspiration, and in the artist, of course, it is a movement within the artist, which it's, in other words, when it becomes a conception, it's the baby already yet, you see. And before the conception, it's the inspiration. And it's a nothing until you conceive of it. But still, it impinges on the artist, and the result is a conception, the artist's conception. And of course, in the poet's case, it's poetic inspiration, which is, there's no explanation for it except in the deep sense that we try to explain what's going on. Otherwise, there isn't any, it just happens. But in this particular instance, there is, as you know, a philosophy in all this, and the philosophy contains elements of explanation, you might say, which may or may not be valid, but that's our choice. We can decide for ourselves whether we like the explanations or not. Yes?
Me?
Yeah, sure.
I believe in that meditation it says, I utter the world by seeing, which would be in line with the
Yeah. Yeah, the eye is, of course, for many people, they think of the eye as a receptive device, but actually this isn't so. It's a creative device as well as being receptive. On one level, it's receptive, and on another level, it's creative. Because it's the lower expression of the power of vision. And on the physical level, it's the power of vision as something that's functional. But we have, as you know, the you know, the old saying, as above, so below. Well, there is an inner eye as well as the outer eye. And the inner eye is the one that can envision. And then this expresses itself through the outer eye. And in this case, it's a positive thing that comes from the inside and works out through the eye into the outside. Instead of, you know, the ordinary situation is that the eye is a major receptive proposition. Yeah.
Aren't we doing this to at least some extent all the time?
Oh, yes. And we all know that everything that's true is true right now. Our problem is that we're unconscious of it. And what we're trying to do is become conscious of what is going on. But everything, there isn't going to be any discovery in the sense that, or there's nothing new about ourselves. It's just that you and I have to make a great effort to discover what we are in the first place, because we don't really know. Yes?
To go back to that symbolism for a minute of hers and yours about the baby, the period of gestation could be the period she's speaking of when she doesn't know just what is going to happen, but it's happening.
Yeah. Well, actually, the moment of conception is not just a moment necessarily, but it can be a rather protracted affair in terms of what we're speaking of. In other words, inspiration doesn't necessarily have to be a thing of a second or a split second or however fine you want to slice it, but it can be rather an ongoing thing.
Most of the things that I do, I say they go through a yeasting period, and they sure do.
Yeah.
You know, you put them aside and let them yeast.
Yeah. But sometimes it works very rapidly. I was reading Priestley's book last night, Man and Time, which is a very interesting book, and he said that I think it was either 3 or 4 really smash hit plays were written in 10 days. And that all the other ones that he did, they were okay, and he got some bread out of them and so on. But the ones that were really fantastically successful were the ones that he wrote almost automatically. In other words, he was in the grip of an inspiration that worked, very swiftly. And I remember too about that Ben Jonson had a similar experience in writing some of his plays, which were very successful. So the time factor is something that's, I think, is a little bit on the flexible side. It may, work very fast, or it may be protracted and work over a period. Of course, the emphasis here is really one of, you might say, separating one's own spirit from everything that is going on, which we've talked about many times here, and the isolation of our spiritual self is an important part of the work that we have to do on ourselves, because we have to realize that the whole scene is something that's very plastic, and the essential part of the whole business is that the spirit actually rules the entire affair. It's not the subject, it's the ruler of the whole business. And insofar as we involve ourselves in, you might say, our own spirit, we become more and more involved in creative acts that represent that spirit rather than what's going on in the world. This is the way it is. So it isn't that the world is not important. Of course it's important. But the world is the medium of expression. And the universe is the medium of expression. And we, you and I and all of us together, are generally involved in the medium rather than in the essence. And so we have to extricate ourselves from the medium and understand that the whole schmear is the medium. That means everything. Our desire nature and the whole bit, which again is well symbolized in this by the fact that these are garments. And then in the following key, in the magician, the desire nature, which is represented by the red robe, is something that he can take off. He doesn't have to sleep in it. He can if he wants to, but he doesn't have to. And he can he can strip down and streak all he pleases. And this is the one thing that is terribly important as far as liberation is concerned. It isn't that we don't want to get out of life. We're not. This isn't our game at all. It isn't that at all. It's rather that we understand what is free and what is bound. And what is free is always free, and what is bound is always bound. And this is the difference between day and night. And we are free. And if we don't feel free for any reason or another, you may be sure that you're in the world of things that are bound. For instance, in literature they say a person is earthbound. Well, this is one way of expressing it, and it's helpful because it means that your mind is all taken up with things that are relative things about the earth and this and that and the other thing. But essentially, we are not all these things. And this is the thing that we, as a work, we have to do in ourselves to free that essential spirit, which is definitely above the universe. In other words, the universe is the playground of the spirit. And the minute that we get bogged down in the universe for one reason or another, either fascinated by it or however we get mixed up with it, and we lose sight of the fact of what we really are, well, then we're in trouble. That's karma. Right then and there, you see. And,
What kind of trouble?
Pardon me?
What kind of trouble? The man
Just
wants to
That's
know.
all the trouble. In other words, all the trouble there is. See? Because the mechanical aspects of the universe, which are immense, they always have a perfectly reasonable basis. There's a reasonable basis for everything that's going on in the universe. But it just so happens that the spirit is above that kind of reason. It's not that the spirit is unreasonable in itself, but it's beyond that kind of reason. We say, for instance, in human terms, the reason she talks like that is because she's a Catholic. Now, from an essential point of view, this is absolutely ridiculous. Of course she talks like that because she's a Catholic. So what? And if she were a Presbyterian, she'd talk like a Presbyterian. Isn't it obvious that this has nothing to do with the essential part of what we are? And we know this, we know this in our hearts that this is so. But we get involved with all this kind of shenanigans, you see, and pass the time this way, which is okay as long as you don't get mixed up in it in your head. Yes?
Well, for me, this is really symbolized by key 7 because the charioteer is in the cube, which symbolizes the universe, and yet he's above it.
Mm-hmm.
And he has control over everything.
Well, since the charioteer is the innermost self, and since the innermost self is precisely the spirit, I think this is jolly good. Jolly good, Maud. Jolly good. Yes.
Is there such a thing as social karma?
Sure.
Karma of society.
Sure. I mean,
to be worked
once you have a kettle of fish, what goes on in the kettle of fish is everything. It's all of them together. And of course, as far as our karma is concerned, it's mass karma, individual karma, tribal karma, and this, that, and the other. And as you can see, from an analytical point of view, it's perpetuated by those who perpetuate it. In other words, you have the institutions who insist on perpetuating themselves, and so the thing goes on and on and on. But from a spiritual point of view, we're supposed to look at it for what it is. In other words, a perpetuation of either wisdom or foolishness, as the case may be. headhunting is very popular among headhunters.
Well, maybe I should
know what
turn
I
my
mean.
question around. Is like, if I found myself in a society of headhunters,
Yes.
or in a country like this.
Well, you practically are in one. You're in the United States. Go ahead.
Headhunters, tail hunters, everything else hunters. Collectors.
Yeah.
Would there be working out my personal karma would also involve working out the karma of my society in terms of my position in it and
Well, not
extraction
necessarily.
and so on.
In other words, if you're a compassionate being, you might say to your fellow headhunters, I would suggest that you wrote them, that your stuff was published posthumously so that they couldn't get your head, But in any case, you could influence them. As a compassionate being, if you saw the light, you could at least point out some of the errors of their ways. But, it wouldn't be wise to confront them and tell them that because in that
Very
case,
difficult to.
yeah, well, I mean, historically, whenever somebody comes along who knows a little more than the other fellow, the first thing everybody wants to do is exterminate him, as you well know. Simply because it's distasteful to hear the truth.
So it's a question of what's effective.
Yeah, and some of the smarter guys have written books and had them published after they died, and then the fat was in the fire, but they were long gone somewhere else, so that at least their fat wasn't in the fire.
Mm-hmm. But what about changes like in China, for example, where you've got all kinds of changes in the potentials and polarities of the society? Is that some kind of working out on this level?
Well, isn't this, currently it's largely the work of one man, isn't it? It's just like Gandhi in India. I mean, if anybody told you that a baby walking around in diapers is going to upset the British government, you'd laugh. You'd say, you must be out of your mind. But here's this guy, this puny little guy walking around in diapers, and he kicked the British out of India. And of course, he took the hard way, but he did it. I mean, he was in jail most of the time, and so were all of his buddies. But they made it work. And of course, here it's not a case of, well, you should do the same or something like that. In other words, you have to be very, very careful about what kind of a guy you are and what your inner destiny is,
Yeah, for sure.
to get away with whatever it is that you're supposed to get away with. To be merely a follower of Gandhi, of course, is completely asinine from an inner point of view. I mean, he worked as a political leader, and as a political leader, he had political followers, and this was a kind of a whole set of circumstances that he was well aware of, and of course he was a brilliant man. So he was working in this area, but somebody else might fall flat on his butt trying to do the same thing and hate Gandhi, So it's, Mao Zedong, he had a charmed life, as you probably know. I mean, they were chasing this guy for years, and they never caught up with him. And he was undoubtedly just going on the inside all the time in order to avoid, execution. It was that simple. And he just managed to elude everybody until the time came when he could exert total power in the country.
And you had to be very together.
Yeah, sure. But the thing is that as far as this system is concerned, the guidance of each individual is strictly a personal matter. I mean, it's an individual matter, and there is nobody can say, now my son, this is what you ought to do, or this kind of jazz. In other words, you're supposed to be guided inwardly. This is all through the tarot and the Qabalah and everything else. It's emphasized again and again and again that this is what it's all about. If you are awakened inwardly, well, you have plenty of guidance. You know what you're supposed to do. You get it from inside of yourself. And invariably, if it comes from the right direction, it's not destructive to other people. It may be more or less constructive, but it's not destructive. In other words, it doesn't go against, we'll say, the Ten Commandments or something like that. It just doesn't work that way because of the source. In other words, if you are getting your messages from a source which is completely above the average human level, you don't have to be involved with fears that you're going to blow the other guy up or something like that. It doesn't work that way because there are safeguards in this particular system, and before you get to yourself, you have to go through mercy, which is also love. That's the fourth center on the tree. And when you go through that particular strainer and they take the pebbles out in that, when you come out on the other side, which is yourself, you have nothing to fear, really, because you're a purified nature, and this puts you in a different class altogether from, we'll say, the ego trip, which is something we're all very familiar with.
The self is victory?
Pardon me?
The self is victory?
No, on the tree, no, it's the top.
Oh,
the crown is so. Yeah.
We were talking about being able to get away with things, and everybody has their own thing that they can do, and it's not necessarily what you can do. It's right for you. And,
that's right.
And it works the other way, too. Some people can't get away with anything. And I was thinking about Frank Sinatra, his recent experience.
Well, yeah, but he's strictly on the ego level. I mean, he's been on it for years, and he's never gotten off it. And it's unthinkable that he's anywhere else, as far as I'm concerned. You know, I mean, when anybody comes on that strong, you may be darn sure that they're on an ego kick, you know. He comes on real strong.
He did alienate a whole country, didn't he, like in about 2 days?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't have any message. He's just for Frank Sinatra. I mean, it's all dollars and cents and glory and the whole bit. I mean, there's nothing about the guy that would indicate that, you know, he's a highly advanced spiritual being, at least not in my book. On the contrary, he seems to me like, you know, a real ego type.
Well, it's pretty obvious anyway that despite his power and despite where he's at and what he's accomplished, he has not been able to create a very good situation for himself, because the kinds of problems that he has to deal with
you can't
are
on
pretty
the ego
ugly.
level. It's impossible. Yeah. You win on one hand, lose on the other all the time, you know. The harder you push, the worse it gets because of the resistance.
Yeah.
You know, there's plenty of resistance, you know. Look at Hitler, my God, while he was going strong, you thought he would have conquered the whole world. But gradually the resistance built up. And when it finally got organized, it crushed him. But for a while, you couldn't stop the guy. He was unconquerable for a while, but then the resistance got greater and greater and greater. Then it got organized, and it finally just squashed him.
Would you have anything to say in relation to why he was able to be so powerful for as long as he was?
Well, anybody can be powerful who wants to be powerful if that's what they want. The door is open to. I mean, our history is full of guys that wanted to be powerful and became very powerful. They might have had to kill a couple of customers along the way, but they made it. I mean, you know, if in the world stage, there's loads of room to be powerful. You know, you can be powerful in money or in anything else. It isn't that difficult. All that you have to be is ruthless to be powerful. That's all. Absolutely ruthless. And then you're powerful right away. I mean, you manipulate people, you manipulate everything without any thought of the other guy at all. And so it works out beautifully.
A lot of the powerless do that too, though.
Pardon me?
A lot of the powerless do that too, though.
Yeah, but I'm talking about somebody who's dedicated to the notion of power, and it's just constantly building it up more and more and more.
Yeah.
And if you're powerful enough, you can obliterate your enemies, which was a path that Hitler took. He actually obliterated his enemies. This is like, if you're in business, shooting your competition.
It's like
It's strictly business. Bang! Well, now there's no competition from that quarter. A bang over here, and there's none from there. So I got a monopoly.
that's describing Nixon's career.
Well, but it isn't that. It may astound people that some of us can become so powerful, but the mechanics of it are not difficult. They really aren't. It's not that hard to understand.
No, I was thinking that for a person to become powerful by being ruthless, there's something more than just being ruthless, because there are powerless people who are ruthless nonetheless. They may have a power in a very circumscribed
field. They not only have to be ruthless, but they have to be highly intelligent. And Jung calls the devil the unregenerate intelligence. This is his definition of the devil. In other words, it's a highly intelligent person who has no concern about his fellow man or humanity or anything else, could care less.
I wanted to ask you something about the key. The spot where the wallet is tied onto the staff is white, and I was curious about that. That's part of the staff or part of the knot?
Oh, well, I don't know why they should be white in it at all, but there is. In other words, there's a white streak going all the way up.
Yeah, that's a reflection, kind of looks like.
Yeah, but the sun's in the back, so it isn't very logical.
No, it isn't.
What do you think about that, David?
Well, it's a very strange anomaly in perspective there anyway, since given the angle that we see the staff from, we shouldn't see that side of the wallet.
Right.
And on the very small keys, the wallet has been fixed. And on the larger keys, it is this way. I don't know what the story is on that. I don't know
But
if
I
it's
think
just
that
bad perspective or somebody.
Anyway, the general significance is so portentous that we can get into the details, but obviously the thing that the full, you might say, his wealth is represented by the wand. This is the archetypal world, and the wallet. It's red, which corresponds to the desire nature. It has the sign of Scorpio on it. It has the eagle on it. It has the eye, which means to make. And the whole business signifies creative power. This is no question about that. Yeah.
Going back to creative power, which is sort of interesting to me in the beginning, is that there's a strange bulk in the fool's body. If you've drawn it, or if you're aware of it, when you paint it, it extends out as if he has a.
I mean the chest area.
Yeah, down low.
The
So
torso.
it's practically like a pregnancy or a tumor or something. And the creative aspect works through the whole picture. Very interesting. There's a negative space camel under his arm. And the camel is Gimel, which is reproduction. And of course, you combine that with the ego, which is the creative, sexual. Then there are all kinds of references to the number 3 and the number 7. I think Maud mentioned the chariot. So if you count from the side where the sun is down, you get the 7th peak is directly between his legs. If you count upward, it is the 3rd peak between his legs. So you get the Venus concept. And then on his chest, it's very noticeable that there is an arrangement of 3 circles which form a water triangle. which again gives you kind of the moose and pregnancy, creative business.
It's a really spread out flat there. It looks like a,
Yeah, like
whereas down below on the front it's around this way.
turned or on an angle, and so it's sort of telling you something that they stick out that particular way. And between them is the three flamed.
Is there by any chance a slight purposeful distortion or twist in the spine that has anything to do with the one in the death key? He's turned a little bit oddly too. I never wondered.
Well, you got a connection
Freak.
with Gimel. Gimel is on the 13th path to the High Priestess, and of course 13 is the number of the Scorpio key.
But I think too that you have to remember that olive is, as far as the top of the tree is concerned, is placed up here, which gives it a peculiar feeling altogether. And the fact that it's up here, you've got three keys here, and they have a special, if you like, vibe, just because they are there. This situation where the Aleph is going this way and the Beth is going this way and the Dalet is in between and this is down here going this way is highly significant as far as each key is concerned. The life breath, which is represented by the Fool and goes down into this, has a certain quality, but you'll notice that all of these aspects contain the other aspects. They're not separated, because nothing is separated. And so it's really more helpful to have a sort of a mishmash of everything. It leads in the right direction more than if you had, we'll say, some specific quality that was all by itself. You might, analytically think that this thing that was out there was just by itself. But you'll notice in the Qabalah and other worthwhile approaches that nothing is to be taken by itself. It's always in association with something else. And in this, the Bina principle, which is here, of course, is represented by the cloak, and this definitely, the root of this fire that's shown here is in Hokmah. So he's all involved with this in spite of the fact that he's on a path coming down this way, which is very much different from the one of the magician. Yeah.
To use what you were talking about, if you actually follow where the Fool would be walking on the path, he would be walking towards the Empress and the High Priestess, which again gives you this reproductive creative thing.
Yeah.
And then there's the factor of the full numeration of Aleph, which is 111, which gives you 3 again. And the fact that it is an ox or a bull, and the ox or bull is ruled by Venus.
Yeah.
So again, it keeps weaving back into that.
I think it's helpful to understand that what starts out very simply becomes complicated in a very short order. In other words, you have really only 3 things going in the beginning. You have one thing which is, from a point of view of analysis, is irreducible and ineffable and in no way can be described. And that's rather typical of Kether. It's a point, and the point doesn't tell us very much. But the minute that the point evolves and starts to express itself, then it gets into complexity. And but before it gets into complexity, we know from such helpful symbols as the Yang Yin that it represents a simple relationship between energy and substance, which in terms of ourselves means the fulfillment of our lives. In other words, we only fulfill ourselves in terms of what is shown here on the tree as male and female, or if you like, energy and substance and so on. But this is the you might say the stage in terms of livingness in which we fulfill ourselves. There's no other stage, it's just this. And we're not going somewhere where there's some fancy business that's different from this. We're going to find ourselves, you might say, in the relationships that are just shown at the top of the tree. That's where it's at. The consciousness and the energy and the substance represent something in ourselves which is eternal. And as we work ourselves out, we're going to find that this is, you might say, the primal scene of what we are. And then there are countless details which more or less fill in this picture. But the essential thing we should never lose sight of, because we can get awful lost in all the details if we forget. Yes?
If that stage isn't big enough for us, that's
Out of someplace to play and to live and so on and so forth. We're not going to run out of the place or the means and so on and so forth. These are always going to be available. But as I say, as we go wandering happily through the Tarot and the Qabalah, if we remember that we can always go back home to the top of the tree, it's a very useful thing for us, because all through the Tarot there are polarities. There are loads of polarities in this key, as well as the other keys, but lots of the others are much more clearly expressed. But you have all kinds of contrasts in this key. You have, the tamasic element, which is the ignorance, the darkness of the outer cloak, is in direct contrast to the spiritual aspect that is shown here, which is in the light. Everything is quite well understood, and in the light we know exactly what's going on. Out here in the universe, we don't know what's going on. See, that kind of contrast. We have ups and downs, and we've got the spiritual sun, and we have the earth. We have all kinds of things that are pretty much contrasted in this particular case. Of course, we know that from the authors of the piece, we know that the fool comes from another life experience and is embarking on a new one. And this is quite interesting as far as the revolution of the Tarot is concerned. As we go through the Tarot again and again and again, each time we reach a higher level. And each time we reach a level of new experiences, which are completely new. They haven't anything to do with the old at all. But the old are the foundation for the new. And it's a case of crawling out of the sea onto the dry land. It really is, which is very much the idea of the moon key. You just, what seemed to you important 5 years ago or 10 years ago is of no consequence in your life. The drama of your life is being lived on a completely different level. That's what I'm talking about. And this goes on and on and on. And each time that we get to a new level, we're just like this. In other words, it's completely new, and it seems as though, it's kind of a challenge. It looks as though we might just step into the abyss, but it doesn't work out that way. Well, of course, if you put which the Kabbalists do, if you put the tree in a circular fashion, well, then the fool becomes very amusing, because he can't fall at all. In other words, he's held by centripetal force to the center. In other words, if you put all these things, one ring inside of the other, and you put the fool in there, why, he's held in a certain position with his head toward the center, which, see, the sun in this corresponds to Kether. This thing here corresponds to Kether, just as you see there. Well, when this is the innermost circle, and that's the next circle, and that's the next circle, and you get a big bullseye thing, well, then he's in a very interesting relationship, because he isn't going anywhere at all. And the cliff doesn't mean anything when you see it in that relationship. It's just, you might say, his outside. which is like our universe. That's our outside. And that's his outside, too. He doesn't have to worry about anything. And we don't either. We do, but that's a compulsive proposition. It's a combination of mostly karma, and then, of course, the karma engenders compulsion. And we think we have to do this, that, and the other thing, and therefore we do it. And we don't, for reasons best known to ourselves, we do not discriminate as to what's going on. I mean, I'm just speaking generally. So it just, it gets thicker and thicker. Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm going to say one of the things that I can vouch for the length of time I've been in this is how fast and how thoroughly the changes take place, and you're usually not aware of them until you look back over your shoulder. Sometimes you can pin it down to a week or two where you've changed radically in reaction to something. And very often I'm asked by people who are not in any kind of study, they will say, well, now honestly, what have you gotten out of it? Tell me, practically, what have you gotten out of your study? And I say, well, I can tell you one thing that was worth all the effort I will ever put in it. I've lost the sense of pressure, totally. I said, that doesn't mean you can be lazy, it's work. And I said, I've lost all sense of pressure.
Yeah.
I said, that's worth the whole thing to me, and it is.
Well, in contrast to that, in a sort of a fun way, we had in our group here for many years, we had a chap who applied himself, and after applying himself for X number of years, he said, this stuff is absolutely useless. He said, "No, I think I can, I can show you the right way," and so he wrote a lot of books, and they were all about, how to travel in your astral body if you didn't have a fort and all this kind of stuff, which is okay, but he completely missed the point of what was going on in this thing, even though presumably he had spent a lot of time with it.
Sounds like Oakfield. You can go places.
Well, I didn't mention any names.
No, I know
You can draw your own conclusions.
Quite a traveler, I know that.
I was thinking about where this pressure comes from. It obviously must come from the world.
No, it actually comes from your innermost self.
Well, what I was thinking was, it seems like a lot of times when I'm under pressure, it's because I've set up my world to put me under pressure. I've run a trip on myself so that I'll come under pressure to make sure that I'll get something done, or some kind of trip like that.
Basically, what I'm talking about is that the self, your self, puts you into a pressure situation so that you'll get out of it. Mm-hmm. And the only way you'll get out of it is to think your way out of it. You'll never get out any other way. In other words, you have to be illumined about the situation. Otherwise, it'll be a repetitive situation. You'll just do it over and over and over again.
Just like key 15.
Yeah. So it's actually the adversary, which is the pressure, comes from within yourself, and it's actually trying to teach you to discriminate upon what is going on, which is absolutely essential. You have to, and of course it's involved with mirth too, because you have to see yourself as a kind of a funny guy in the first place before you would do that. If you take yourself very, very seriously, well then, you can get into all kinds of fascinating corners, about yourself, well, this guy did this and this and this and this.
I have a question about what you're saying.
And the conditions were like this, and so on and so forth. And it was always something else. It was never you.
Mm-hmm.
You never had anything to do with it. It was always, well, he screwed me. the conditions were completely wrong, and I didn't know it at the time, and I got myself in up to here. Blah 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 blah.
That's the game of wooden leg.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got this wooden leg. You know, you can't expect me to do that.
Yeah. So the last place you would turn for an explanation should be the first place, and the only way that you can come to this is through a more or less mirthful approach. You have to expect, when you're dealing with yourself, you have to expect to find a fool somewhere in there, you know, a real fool, and that's what you find, invariably. Yeah.
My question now has to do with exactly what you're talking about. When you go to make a decision, or there's something you need to think carefully about, you know, some decision to be made, then you do this thing that some people call meditate, right? And one thing you're supposed to do is not be involved in the decision. I mean, have this mirthful aspect you're talking about, so that you can be free to let things work in your mind, and you need, right? I mean, that's the idea. So you're not attached. Isn't that why you're talking about this mirthful, non-heavy approach? But anyway, my question is that I do that. You know, I say, well, you know, I convince myself that I'm a funny person. I convince myself, you know, that it's all part of this kind of, you know, play that we're in. And then what I end up saying is, well, it doesn't make any difference, you know, what my decision is. It doesn't make any difference. It's not important.
Well, mind you, whenever anybody makes a statement, it's made on a certain level. You know, I mean, it's made for the time, it's made for the circumstances and everything else. It's not valid on all levels, and it's not valid in all times. You know that as well as I do. In other words, in an absolute sense, you can take a very strange view of life in general. In a relative sense, you can. So it just depends on, you know, where you are and what you're trying to do and everything else. In other words, let's say that you're involved in business, as I am, well, it's very easy for me to see that even though there's a lot of business that bores me, the reason that I do it is because I want to support a whole lot of things that I like that are not important either, but I want to support them anyway. So I suffer this to support that, but essentially it's just a game. I mean, there's no importance in it. It doesn't signify anything. It's just the way I want to play that particular game. But the main thing is to be aware of it, so that you don't think that you're caught up in it in some way, that you're locked in or something of that sort.
However, sometimes you're involved in decisions that affect other people that you're responsible for, and see right away that's a trip that's laid on you. You have responsibility then.
Well, what are you talking about, children, or?
For example.
Yeah, well, of course you have a responsibility with children, and you took on the responsibility to children because obviously your inner self wanted you to have that responsibility. It's something you damn well needed. In other words, this is a sure cure for selfishness, isn't it? It opens you up to other people besides yourself. In other words, your kids. You have to be giving with your kids. I mean, you either do or you don't. You have to be generous about a family, don't you? I'm just saying ideally. Some people aren't, but I mean, this is what the idea is, that it opens you up. Instead of being just me, myself, and I, you're involved with an immediate family and all the connections and everything that go on in a family. This is a different kind of life altogether. And then presumably, as they say in India, when you get through the family thing, you can concern yourself with even wider relationships than family relationships. But at least you've got to start. You're not just thinking about yourself all the time. Whereas if you don't get involved in family and you're a certain type of person, you can get completely wrapped up in yourself, and then you get very queer. You know, extremely queer.
That's true.
Because you've met this kind of queer person, and of course we all have. And it's a kind of a sad situation compared with what people can be. You know, there's. Yes, David.
Well, just to complicate the matter, the children have also chosen you, or whoever is involved, so they've chosen a particular type of parent.
Oh, sure.
So it's
Sure.
not just
It's like
Sure.
the Norrance says the same thing. This book I've been reading on death. It's called the Book of Death and Spirit and Hindu Spiritism. It says exactly the same thing. That a child, which is a spirit in itself, though its flesh is infinite, it still has decided to take you on as a parent.
right. So you gotta,
So you're actually
The contract.
switch around.
so you don't have to feel that responsible in one sense. It's not just you choosing the child; it's also the child.
A lot of
choosing
times,
you.
what he says is that it's to help the parents have children. The children are there to educate the parents because their past experiences.
Well,
they have no knowledge.
being a parent myself,
The intuition.
being a parent myself, my first observation about children has been that they do most of their growing all by themselves,
Yeah.
and that sure they need a little bit of help, but as far as telling them how to grow up or something like that, that's ridiculous. They grow up pretty much on their own, and they seem to have at least my observation is that they seem to have the innate ability to just take the whole thing on, incredible as it is. I mean, it's unbelievable that a child can encompass what they have to encompass. To me, it's tremendous what they do. I don't know how they do it, as a matter of fact, but they do it.
You did it.
Yeah, but when I look back on it, I can't believe it, and I can't believe how it works at all, because it's to me, it's a great hassle to be a child.
Oh, it's the worst.
And it's just like a plant pushing up through hard earth, and just going like this, and just keep going and going and going and going and going. And to me, that's very fascinating. And of course, I hold to the view that most of the growing up is done by themselves, and that they're like plants in the sense that if you monkey with plants too much, you'll kill them. They won't hack it if you.
One of the problems with that is that other people are messing at the same time.
Oh,
If you don't
sure.
mess, they get the other person's
Oh
mess.
my God! As I say, when we get to
I'd rather
this
have
point,
my mess than
but when we get to this point where we are now, and we begin to look back at the whole mess, we wonder how in the heck we ever got to this point, which is, a miracle in itself. The fact that we could emerge from all the stupidities and all the follies and all the nonsense that we've been exposed to and told over and over and over again until we could scream that these were realities. This is what's going on, chum. Get with it, so on. So the fact that we could get through all this crap is a miracle. It's a miracle.
Yeah.
That's the way I feel about it. Yes.
if you've gotten through it.
To go back just a wee speck to the sense of humor thing, I told somebody today, and I do believe this, it's very true, that if you have a real deep working sense of humor, not just a joke, ha-ha, but a real sense of humor, the sense of the ludicrous, I have never yet seen that type of person beating their breasts and saying, why did this have to happen to me? I've never seen that in one person.
Yeah.
Which I think tells us so.
That's true.
Yes.
Fit the pattern on the trestle board, so it takes care of that.
Yes, you wanted to
Um,
comment.
I was just thinking that aside from the kind of contract between the parent and the child, like every encounter that we have with other people has this kind of contractual aspect.
Oh yeah.
This is the karmic thing
Yeah.
working out not just between parents and children, but between you and me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, of course, I think it's very helpful if we realize that there is such a thing as karma, because whether it's true or false is immaterial. It's such a helpful way of looking at things that we should embrace it anyway. Whether it is true or false doesn't make too much difference, for the simple reason that it teaches us to look below the surface, in any case, and not to get too excited. our tendency is very simply to think that, for instance, if we embark on something like the Tarot, the Qabalah, something like that, that this is going to make our life easier in some way or other, you know. It does and it doesn't. It makes it easier in the sense that we learn how to handle the good and the bad and the indifferent. That's how it makes it easier, which is a great deal. But we are still subject to the good, bad, and indifferent. I mean, we don't get out of it. I mean, this is sort of standard equipment among people who know what's going on, is that you can't change conditions just like that, you know. But what you can do is that you can understand conditions. And when you understand them, it takes a lot of the sting out right then and there.
It's like the difference between Aikido and pratfall, or Tai Chi and drunk stomach.
And then another thing, too, which is an old saw as far as philosophy is concerned, that philosophy anticipates the event. I mean, this is part of philosophy, to anticipate the event. In other words, to see it as a possibility. Well, when you see it as a possibility and it happens, it doesn't surprise you. It doesn't catch you unawares, you know, and give you a lot of trouble. You can see that it's in the cards, as the saying goes. And that's philosophy. In other words, if you're living in a world of fools and you think that you're not going to be hurt by foolishness, there's something wrong with your head. You know, it's bound to get to you. You can't get away from it if you live in that kind of a world. And of course we do. So we, you know, in a world where everybody is ripping everybody else off, which is the kind of a world we live in, we must expect to get ripped off. And we are ripped off, all of us. We know that, you see. But then we can say, well, it's that kind of a world. Now, what am I going to do about it? And if I want to make a protest, it's my privilege to make a protest. Or if I have any suggestions, that's my privilege. If I want to start a movement, if I feel that I'm going to be the guy to change the whole thing, that's your privilege too, depending on how you feel about it. But as Shaw said, you know, when you're living in a madhouse, look out for the paranoids. You know, he's right. He's right. You've got to be careful. You just have to be careful. You have to be, you know, you have to be aware of what's going on.
I remembered something else that he said about children and not wanting to let your children getting into somebody else's mess. But if they elect to make that kind of a contract now, are they competent to do that or not? That's the question.
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, well, I don't know how that lies. You know, the protective role of the parent.
Just for example, you know that it's the law here that you have to send your children to school. So that's the law. So the minute you send them to school for years and years and years, what's going to happen to them? Well, the same thing.
School too.
Pardon me?
You have the right to choose the school.
If you got the right of
Well, not if it's a public school anymore.
Yeah, well, what I mean is, if you have the means, you can send them.
Oh yeah, if you have the means. But I'm talking about Joe Dotes. People like myself. I didn't have the means, so I sent them to school. Well, now my kids would be bussed around, you know.
There are free schools?
Well, relatively free schools, yeah.
Oh, $80 a month or something per
I
child.
don't know, or exchange of some service or something.
You know, I'm talking about the general run, you know.
Yeah.
Like the gal who works with me, her kids live 2 blocks on the wrong side of Castro, so they're bused from 24th and Castro down to Chinatown, and they go to what's his name? This one over here. It's got an American name, but it's a Chinese school. And they are 4 blocks from the local school, you know. This kind of stuff. And of course, as far as the ideas that the kids are exposed to, I can vouch for the fact that once they're in the school, they're exposed to whatever ideas are being presented in the school. This is something I'm very familiar with because I was in quite a few of them. And, they're influenced and so on and so forth. As I say, it's a miracle that we're here. That we've emerged.
We have a terrible educational system.
Pardon me?
We do have a terrible educational system because, like I made pretty good grades when I was in school. All through high school, I made A's and B's and honor rolls and all this. And when I got out of school, I just said, no, I can go on to college with a scholarship, but if I have to keep learning what I'm learning, it's going to just degrade me. I didn't learn anything until I just quit going to school.
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate because I had to work all the time I was going to school, so at least I was learning something. I was, I had responsibilities, and I was gaining practical experience. And, I've been living off it ever since, but some things that I had in school, for example, I had 6 years of French, and which was, it's like having a permanent toothache. And so at the end of 6 years of French, I was reading Racine, and I was, of course, reading, who was the other guy who used to drive me crazy? But anyway, there was another one. And all these things were absolutely, hopelessly uninteresting to me. But I had to do them, I needed the points, and I was told this is what you do, and so I did it. Well, I give you my word of honor that ever since I left school, I have never used my French at all. Never. Not in the slightest. I've never read anything in French. I haven't any French friends, and I couldn't say boo to a goose in French today.
You avoid them all like the plague.
But, c'est la vie. That's the way it is.
Didn't you run into tarot in school?
Well, that really, Columbia might have been, you might just as well have said, well, didn't you run into tarot because you were living in New York? Because it was that sort of thing, really. It wasn't...
He was a teacher, though, at Columbia.
Yeah, he was a teacher at Columbia. He was also a student of Paul Case. So I'm not saying that there isn't such a thing as manifest destiny, David. I'm not trying to get out of that. But as far as Columbia is concerned, it could well have been that Professor Tassin, who was the only guy in New York who was teaching the tarot, I could have become involved with him in some other way because I was in Theosophy and somebody, as a matter of fact, it was because of my activities in Theosophy that I got involved in the tarot in the first place, really. So it was a theosophical connection, really, that brought it about more than anything else. But I won't deny that strange things happen. No, I won't do that. That would be a lie that I wouldn't subscribe to. Yes?
Still kind of putting school in perspective like we were doing. I didn't make such very good grades, but sort of middling grades, which meant that I had time and energy to learn things.
Well, I give you my word of honor that when I was going to Columbia, I was spending most of my energy on things I was interested in that I wasn't studying in school at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's true. It's true.
I was beating my brains out in directions that had absolutely nothing to do with the curriculum, and the school had nothing to do with it at all. I mean, definitely. They weren't promoting it or anything else. I was interested in it, so I did it on my own, and probably if I had spent as much time in my studies, I'd have been a Rhodes Scholar or something like that. But, I just went ahead and read what I damn well pleased, and that was that. And, sort of gave lip service to, the university.
It's nice that the fool is over justice, which is education.
Yeah.
In the tableau.
But, I mean, we all know what's going on, and we all know that an educational institution is exactly that. And it's just, it's one of those things like, let's say, mass-produced automobiles. If you want to get a car for, we'll say, under $5,000, you've got to mass-produce the damn things. And when you do that, you get into a lot of trouble right off the reel, because you know that they're not going to be given that extra touch of care that would go into a really fancy handmade job. They just don't take the time. They slap them together, but you can still get one for under $5,000. And that's the way it is with the education. You get a kind of an education, It has some value, It's a kind of an education. But of course, from the point of view of the Tarot and the Qabalah, it's a joke. It's a joke because it's not sufficiently tied to reality. Education should be an education, as far as this is concerned, is something that involves the immediacy of life at every point. See? In other words, you can get as theoretical as you please, but you have to say, and this refers to this, and back and forth, and this gives you the mastery of how to bake a cake and how to do this and everything else. This theory brings you to mastery in this and this and this and this, and not just study abstractions over here with no manipulations on the other side. And this is ridiculous, because as far as the exercise of the mind is concerned, you have such things as music, for instance, which you can really exercise your mind in music, as you well know, and art, you see. And now they're coming to pretty much teaching music and art as part of the curriculum. This is getting to be more and more so, as the Greeks did. But when I went to school, forget it, man.
I know.
Forget it. I mean, you get into harmony and all this stuff, and you can beat your brains out with this. It's very intricate and it's super. When you get all through, you can do something. But the only thing I really learned when I was in boarding school was manual training, and that's something I use every weekend. The other stuff doesn't do me much good on the weekends. I didn't learn how to garden, I didn't learn anything about plants. I didn't know how to milk a cow or how to paint a wall or how to do anything, except manual training. I did learn how to saw wood and how to use a square, and a few other elements. And since I've been married, I've been using this all the time. And none of the other stuff, Yes, David.
Well, I have a kind of theory that we aren't doing what we're doing, really. That we're doing something and we think that's important, but all the other things around it are really the important thing that's happening.
Yeah.
So like going to school, for example, it may seem like that's what we're going to school for, but there's a whole vast occurrence going on in group relationships and everything, and bits of information that are being fed in situations which we're dealing with, which is not the ostensible work that we're doing, but it is the real work that we're doing.
Yeah.
You mean the peripheral?
Well, that's
us.
please,
really.
But please don't give that priceless thought to the educational system. Keep it a secret, Dave, will you?
I think they know it. That's what they're afraid of. Somebody finding it out.
Yeah.
This is what I can understand. Okay, you can go to school, and I tried. I'm into music. I'm a writer and composer. I've been in music since I was 3 years old, and my generations for generations. Okay, I tried to get some scholarships into some music conservatories and these colleges, and they says that my family standing wasn't belonging to this ethnic like to a religious background. I wasn't Catholic, Jewish, or I wasn't into this political structure. My parents had no affiliation with this and that, and it's really a joke to way that our country, and basically our country is the only thing I can speak for, is our educational system is so screwed up. I don't see why the politicians or the people in control now aren't doing something about that. It seems like to me that everybody in school was like sheep in a flock, and that some people sat up here in the big government and said, well, we'll just teach them how to make money, and we'll control them.
Well, they don't even teach you that.
I mean, you go and you learn your basic things, mathematics, you learn English, and basically that's all they teach you.
Yeah. I agree. But I personally, I've had the good fortune of meeting people who have been educated in frankly the opposite way from our system. And one fellow I knew who came from a very wealthy French family. He never went to school, a regular school, until he went to college. And prior to the time that he went to college, he had a tutor, and what they did was that they went to all the industries in France and studied what was going on in the industries and how it was done. He learned how to do it rather than just look at it. He had to go and learn the technique and the mathematics of it and the this and that and the other. Well, then he went to college, and he graduated from college before he was 20. He had his doctorate in chemistry, and he was also a very, very fine mathematician. And the first job that he had when he came over to the United States was designing propellers for the Cramp Shipbuilding Company in Philadelphia. In other words, which was a pretty heavy deal because they come kind of high, But I mean, he had an extremely responsible job. And then he finally wound up as a consulting chemist for DuPont. But the point was, as he explained it to me, that by the time he got into formal education, he had such a tremendous practical background that it was just duck soup for him. In other words, he really knew what it was all about. Yeah.
It seems to me that educational institutions are part of the sort of a failure filter of the society, at least in this society. It sort of takes those who are predefined as failures and, gives them all this kind of pressure to make sure that they will turn out so. Convinces them that indeed that's who and what they are.
Yeah, well, in England it's a different scheme altogether. There's on the what would be the high school level here, they have a weeding out process in England. Are you familiar with it? And what happens is that you either make it or you don't make it, and if you don't make it, it's very hard to get back into education at all. In other words, you can't get into higher education unless you've done something pretty fantastic before you get out of high school, which is quite different from here. And if you don't cut the mustard, then you go into a trade, and that's where you stay in England. I mean, you stay there for the rest of your life unless you're an unusual sort of character,
So it's even more rigid in a way.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
also more practical.
There are 3 zeros in the pool key.
Good.
I mean, with the counting the 2 zeros in the pool itself on that line, and the zero is the form. The oval is the form of the akasha, which is the mother substance. So you get back to that creative mother.
Your mouth makes an O when you look foolish.
That's good for you. That's what I'm
Yeah.
It's a very
What is those Hebrew letter right there? What is that?
it's a very graphic art.
Paula, you mean this one?
Yeah.
What happened
That's
to your
Aleph.
tape
That's the initial letter
Started
in
eating
the
tape.
Hebrew alphabet.
What?
That's
What?
the initial letter.
Is it called
Aleph.
olive?
Yeah. It's like the Greek alpha. In fact, they're very, very close as far as Aleph, alpha. They're like this, like they have in Greek alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Well, we have Aleph, Gimel, Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet. You see, they're very, very close. Yeah.
I was just noticing as you were doing that, but Lamed, or L, which would be Lamed, is right next to the Aleph, which is the ox. So the education and the ox goad is working right there.
Yeah. And of course, this in the Qabalah is one of the most popular names of the Lord, of God, is Aleph and Lamed.
Reversed.
Yeah, L.
Yeah.
Or,
Well, reading Hebrew-wise, this one.
Yeah, it would be Aleph and then Lamed. Yeah.
I just wanted to make one observation about the full key and the symbols on his clothes. His clothes are what he is, what you can see. What can I look at to see what the fool is? And then the highest symbol, the first symbol on his clothes, is the one on his left shoulder, which is the sun and the moon, which is like the two pillars of the tree of life. And then you may say, well, the sun and the moon, is like the ancient work of the philosopher's stone, integrating the two parts of your personality. How do I do that? What can I look at? And you look at the rest of the clothes, and you see all the mechanisms of what getting the sun and the moon business together really is about. And sort of like the two prominent symbols are the basic idea of the work of the sun and the moon. And then the rest of the symbols are all the parts of this machinery that you have to work with as keys. So
that's interesting in relationship to the Yod He Vov He, which continues right over from there. So it's like that's an explanation or a development of some
Here's the name of God.
formula.
Mr. Goodspeed, would you like to join us? Well, he's a pretty complicated guy, Mike. And we are.
I'm enjoying, by the way, I'll transcript the book.
Yeah, well, have you seen this book of Priestley, Man and Time? He's a fun guy, Priestley. He's not stuffy, and he has quite a lot to say about Ouspensky and Nickel and Nuraj and a whole bunch of them. But apparently there was a guy named Dunn who was quite a hotshot on the subject of time. He goes into that pretty thoroughly. But take a look at that. I don't know whether they have it here or not. Do you have that book, Mickey, Man and Time? Do you have that? Yeah. Probably bring it out in paperback, in which case it would be a good,
Did you have that Hermes before the one I had for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you can give it to somebody else that doesn't have it.
Yeah, that's from, you mean Seligman's History of Magic? That one?
Well, the one I brought you this.
Yeah, well, that's from Seligman's History of Magic, which is a very interesting book.
Was it beautiful?
Well, it's literally true that we're in such a, you might say, primitive state of knowledge. I'm speaking generally as far as, well, the West is concerned. In fact, the whole world is concerned. We have a long way to go in terms of education of the right kind, and especially in the psychological area. So those of us who make the effort, of course, gain a tremendous amount of advantages in terms of our immediate selves, you know. We can't do very much for, as you know, analysis sometimes is helpful for the other person, but it isn't always helpful. If you tell the other fellow what's the matter with him or something like that, it's not always the greatest idea in the world, and sometimes it's like water on a duck. But in terms of our own welfare, it's of utmost importance to you and to me, insofar as we can give this kind of work time and energy to pursue it, because it appears that this is what it's all about. In other words, this is what life is all about, is emerging from rather dismal states of consciousness into something better. And it can be pretty dismal, as we all know. To be locked into the everyday world, in the heavy sense of the everyday world, is very, very sad. And is very definitely, this is one way out. There are other ways, but this is surely one way out of that kind of business. And it uses, of course, the analytical method. And eventually, having analyzed ourselves in terms of what's going on, we get to a more creative level where we don't have to concern ourselves so much with everyday relationships, and we can devote more of our energies to that part of our career which is an essential feature of ourselves. See, it's very hard for us in the everyday world to really get into an area of self-expression which is, you might say, on a high level. We can always pound salt, that's easy. But I was speaking rather that this problem of self-expression is not my telling you or somebody telling you this is what you're supposed to do, but it's a case of finding out for yourself and then doing something about it. And it isn't easy, and it's rather a time-consuming process, and it's a lot like the Hindu idea of not this and not that, but ultimately we can find the area that we can move in. And the acid test, as I've said many times, is that you can work in this area day after day after day and year after year and be completely happy in this particular work that you're doing. That's the test. And this is in contrast to most of the compromises that we make in the everyday world. Because if we're going to live in the United States of America, we have to make compromises. One way anyway, that we can straighten ourselves out, and that is that we can think of ourselves sort of like departmentalized, and that we do a certain amount in order to sustain ourselves in this society. In other words, we give a certain amount, we get a certain amount, and that sustains us. But beyond that, we're our own boss. And it gets kind of amusing at times that we think that we need a whole lot of things to sustain us, which of course we don't need. So that's a kind of joke, which is an ongoing joke for all of us. And as long as we know it's a joke, well, then it remains a joke. It doesn't get serious. It takes very little to sustain us, and then, of course, this gives us an opportunity to pursue more important things as far as ourselves are concerned. But we, as I say, we make compromises. And so we get the car, and we get the house, and we do this and we do that and the other, but we have to always, in our heads, we always have to remember that this is a conscious compromise on our part. That takes the sting out of it, because then it becomes a joke. We say, well, you know.
So it's your choice.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm damn fool enough to go for all this, I'm a damn fool as far as this particular thing is concerned. Okay, so I'm crazy, but that's the way I am, and I can see it, and so this takes the sting out.
Does that make it easier when a fender gets banged up on your car?
Oh yeah, sure it does. Well, it's it's like the old saying. If you live in a land where there are no automobiles, you'll never die in an automobile accident. That's the way it works. You may fall in the bathtub or fall off a horse, but you'll never be killed in an automobile accident. I think that one of the greatest boons in this whole affair is that if you can see what's going on, that's half the battle, right there. It's when you're unconscious that it hurts the most. When you're a kid, you think that it's all happening to you and none of this is happening to anybody else. We've talked about that before, And that's a miserable way to feel. It really is. Once you realize that you're, a Slav among a billion or 3 billion other Slavs, where life becomes immediately bearable. But, it's sort of like learning to ice skate. When everybody's learning to ice skate and everybody's taking pratfalls and banging themselves in the head and everything else, well, then it becomes a comic scene. And that's just exactly the kind of a scene that we're in, including the President of the United States taking a pratfall, Now, you know perfectly well that Nixon, for example, he didn't want to take a pratfall. Nobody does. He didn't want to embarrass himself. We know enough about human nature to know that. And nobody wants to do this. But it happens every day of the week. It happens to everybody, you, me, and everybody else. We can't avoid it. But when you're young, you think it's just you. And you feel pretty miserable about it. But when you get older and you see the whole world falling on their butts, you say, well...
What a picture.
Why?
Everybody did it.
Why scream? And so when the fellow points to you and says, you, then you go, you, like the Marx Brothers. He goes, you, and then you go, you. And what's he going to say? Because it's true. In other words, everybody's complaining about what they've chosen for themselves. The total of everything that we've chosen for ourselves is what we've got.
Jason, I was wondering, this reminds me of something you said before about you don't want to confront somebody with something, but it might be good to point it out to them. And I was thinking of a dear friend of mine who's a very judgmental person and is always complaining about circumstances and really has trouble seeing any responsibility that she has for her life, And I wish there was something I could do. Do you have any suggestions?
I'm afraid not, because sooner or later, I don't know how much intelligence this friend of yours has, but sooner or later, she's either going to get tired of this way of being, or she isn't. As a case, but as far as you can live a whole lifetime this way, and again, it's like water on a duck. It may work and it may not work. It's not going to hurt her to point something out. It isn't going to hurt her, but don't expect what I'm trying to tell you, because we're friends. Don't expect anything.
Least of all appreciation.
Well, don't expect anything. In other words, you can say, you can put it out there, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And you can say, look, sweetie, did you ever think of this or this or this? And the reaction is something, only God knows what's going to happen, but don't get involved in that. In other words, don't expect anything. You know?
There's also ways to present things to people, where you don't incur that necessity for a reaction. You can just say, I just want to say this, and you can do it in such a way that she won't hate
I'm
you
very
for it.
diplomatic. She
Probably
loves
she
me
won't.
very much. But I don't know.
So your
Sometimes I get
mother?
really frustrated.
Well, I know that, just as they say, you can talk, you can try to persuade and everything else. In some cases, it'll be fantastic what will happen. And in other cases, you can talk till you're blue in the face and nothing will happen. And you have to be prepared for either result. And for heaven's sake, don't get yourself involved in it, because that won't work either. Because then you could lose a friend, which is kind of ridiculous, really. Looking around at just some of the very dear friends I've had who were difficult people, and still very, very good friends. And hell, they died difficult people,
You love them anyway.
Well, sure. I mean, that's when you're friends with somebody, you should make a lot of allowances, because hell, you're not perfect either. Nobody's perfect, so you put up with a whole bunch of nonsense, but that really doesn't disturb the friendship. But I'm just telling you that in my own experience, I'm thinking one gal in particular, and she said to me one time, she said, my life just seems to be one damn thing after the other. It's rough. And I said, I know it's rough. And she said, well, do you think it'll ever stop? And I said, well, frankly, no. As long as you ask me. I don't think so. I think it's going to keep right on the way it is. She said, oh, I mean, it wasn't any surprise to her.
She said, oh.
She said, oh. As though, that's pretty much the way I expected it to be, too. And that's the way it was. She was almost always in a stink, and it stayed that way right up until she died. She died very young, but it never let up. Of course, it was herself. It was,
She never got tired of it, huh?
No.
You were answering for her? You were answering coming from where she was at? Your answer, if it was going to continue this way, came from the standpoint that for her it is going to continue this way, but not necessarily for everyone?
Well, I was just answering her honestly. I could see that, I knew what kind of a person she was, and and she was very, as they say now, very masochistic. And so as long as she persisted in this way of living, which she was doing every day of her life, and this had become habitual for her, as long as she persisted in this, and there was every evidence that she would, because there was nothing to stop her.
You didn't see any way out for her.
No. Because she enjoyed that. You see, this was her way of... She liked the game.
Fulfilled.
Well, that's what a masochist is somebody enjoys being miserable and creates a life situation where they can depend on being miserable. They're going to get it all the time. And, classically they set up a sort of a little drama that's going to eventuate in just one sure last scene where everything gets real heated up and they get hell in the end. That's the classical death,
That's Nixon.
Yeah, true.
On a grand scale.
True.
Masochist.
Well, he's from our point of view, he's a very, very interesting person because of the obvious different aspects of his makeup, he's complex, and all the different dynamic forces that were working in Nixon there, something that's pretty easy to see from our point of view, because we're, you know, he was in the goldfish bowl, and we were all watching it from the outside.
I guess all paranoids in general are masochistic.
Well, it's, you know what the managers say, that everybody's a little bit touched. The thing is that, well, they go further and say we are all touched. See? But the difference between somebody who was seriously touched and those, the rest of us who are all touched, is simply a matter of degree. So the paranoid is simply the fearful aspect of ourselves carried to an extreme.
I think it has a lot to do also with the hopes that people have. You know, some people have a whole bunch of hope, and they really see good things. They really want a whole bunch of good things, and they're continually frustrated because they want so much, and they've not been able to integrate their desire.
Good night.
Right.
Good night. Well, hope, of course, is ridiculous as far as the Qabalah is concerned. The reason it's ridiculous is very easy to explain. You have everything already, you see. The only thing is that you're unaware of it. That's the problem. In other words, you're unconscious. You know, you're the rich man's son, but you don't know it. That's the problem. And so what it means in terms of suffering, it means that you have screwy values that are learned values, and you have to unlearn all those and start in from scratch and get down to reality. And then you begin to come into your heritage. Because you see, the highest goal in life is satisfaction. And that is something that doesn't depend on hope. This is something that is, we have the capacity for complete satisfaction. But we don't find it in the usual channels. In other words, the way we're taught to get satisfactions are material channels and so on and so forth.
It seems to me you left out one thing, though. It's also important. It's also working, and also you have to deal with, and that's the part of your karma. You know, I have certain things that I was born into or got into somehow that I had to work through and deal with. For example, making money or survival or providing for my children or whatever it is. And that's, you know, my hopes of getting my life together.
Yeah, but see, you got into that completely at an unconscious state. I've been all through this, so I know there was no matter. Hell, I didn't know what was going on when I got married. You know, I just got married. And when I had kids, I didn't know what was going on. I just had kids. All of a sudden, they were there, you know. There was no, you know, big occult twazoo about what was going on, you know. And, you know, I had this big vision, and all the main guys were there, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And, forget it, man. I was as stupid as the next guy, see. So what I'm trying to say is, there was no consciousness in the sense that I'm talking about here. There wasn't any consciousness involved in hope. That was all karma, in other words, and all unconscious as far as I was concerned. When I'm talking about, I was talking about things in an absolute sense when I was talking about that we have the capacity for complete satisfaction. And it runs exactly counter to the world, at right angles to it. It has nothing to do with the world at all. In other words, in our spirit, we have a perception which is, as the Hindus would say, bliss. That's the highest satisfaction there is. It's bliss, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And they tell us that it's a way of being able to see, or a kind of awareness that we're capable of. And that's what I was talking about. You know, but that's an absolute proposition as opposed to, you know, I like French fries and you know, and steamed clams and all the rest of it, as well as the next guy. But I wasn't talking about that. You know. And kids are fun, and dogs are fun, and all kinds of things are fun.
Something higher than baklava. Oh,
Well,
that's good.
Yeah, but in other words, the self is, as they say, the enjoyer, and they describe it as knowledge, existence, and bliss. It's all wrapped up in the self, and so it's a kind of goal. You know, it's a kind of a thing that we keep working toward. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't enjoy dry roasted peanuts in the meantime. It doesn't mean that at all. It's just that we have to keep this in our head so that we don't lose the essential little spark that's in this notion.
Isn't that right back to discrimination up there in 6? I mean, that's the relative value of things, or their place and their relative importance.
Yeah. You had a comment, David?
Oh, just that if you get rid of hope, you also get rid of fear, so that you're in reality.
Yeah.
Nice
This is
Yeah, right.
this is what I was talking about mainly, which again is I was talking from the absolute point of view. Sure, you have to have hope on a certain level. It's very necessary. Faith, hope, charity, and all these things are all true on a certain level. But when it comes to the self, which is our main concern, well, then something else takes the place of hope.
What?
Surety.
Right.
That's the 8th thing in the pattern.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, and then instead of hope, you have
Not assured knowledge.
yes, yeah. So you don't have to depend on hope anymore. And then, of course, as you know, our sensibilities develop, and we get into, as Paul points out in his remarks about Sheen and so on, we get into areas of awareness that were simply closed to us in the past, and as we do, again, we're supported in ways that were not open to us in the past. So we have much more support than we'll say average. This is all part of the getting rid of a lot of things like hope and we'll say prayer in the ordinary sense of praying for something.
Would you put that on Gabura, hope and fear?
Well, I think that's well put, really, because that whenever you get into something like fear, you're really talking about hope as well, aren't you? I mean, it doesn't. In other words, unless you're destroying something, which is the fear element coming in, that's the something that you're going to destroy is where the hope is. This is your project, your pride and joy, and everything else. And everything that you hold precious is the basis for your fears.
It creates a lot of action.
Oh yeah, a lot of anxiety too, a lot of stresses. Well, thank you so much for joining me. As always, I do appreciate it. I enjoy your company very, very much.
You do.
Well, we get into a much different trip
Yeah, we always do.
from the pool. We get into the magician. So obviously, the whole attitude of this fellow is that he's doing something of a very specific character, and 3 guesses. What is he doing? So what he's doing actually is he's the energizer in the magician, and the business of energizing is something that's really a lot of fun, because this is how we make things happen. It's by the energizing aspect of ourselves. And when he's performing that, you'll notice that he can take off the red robe, but while he's doing what he's doing there, he's wearing this red robe of desire, and so the desire nature is very much part of this energizing that's going on. I think you'll enjoy this poking around in the magician key. I hope so. Until then, alles gut.